Hello and welcome to Ask the Expert, a daily series from 8:30 a.m. to 9 a.m. to help small businesses. You can ask me any questions in the comments or by using the hashtag QBATE on Twitter. If you need any more advice, you can join the official Intuit QuickBooks SMB community group on Facebook. Accountants and business experts are on hand 24/7. QuickBooks also have a dedicated information site to help you coming out of lockdown. Just go to the QuickBooks website, scroll down a little bit, and click on the big Learn More button under the header Support for You and Your Business during COVID-19. Hello, and I'm Toby Mildon, and I'm a diversity and inclusion consultant, and I'm author of the best-selling book Inclusive Growth. And some of my recent clients have been working with Sony, looking at unconscious bias within decision making. I've also been working with HarperCollins Publishing on becoming a disability confident employer, and then also working with the online retailer AO, helping them develop an inclusive growth strategy. So I first got involved in diversity and inclusion when I was working for the BBC. When I came out of university, I had a career working in technology. I was an IT consultant for Accenture. I worked in healthcare technology, and then I worked for many years as a technical project manager at the BBC. And I was working in our technology department, and I was reporting into our chief operating officer. And he was really concerned at the time that the technology department of the BBC was very male dominated. So I worked with him to create our gender balance action plan, and that's when I first started to get involved in diversity and inclusion. I then moved into radio, uh, so I could look at diversity on the airwaves. And then after that, I decided to go back to the corporate sector where I worked for Deloitte. I was attracted to Deloitte because they had much more of a focus on culture change um, than um, than we did at the BBC. So I normally work with big organizations and medium-sized enterprises. But when I was writing an article for chief executives of small to medium-sized enterprises, I came across a really interesting statistics from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And they said that SMEs account for 99.9% of the business population. 99.3% of these businesses employ up to 49 employees, and 0.6 account for businesses that employ up to 250 employees. So that's a massive proportion of organisations in the UK that are considered small to medium sized enterprises. Now, only 0.1% of businesses employing more than 250 people, which interestingly is the kind of the tipping point for reporting on the gender pay gap, they only account for 0.1% of businesses in the UK. So it got me thinking that the small and medium-sized enterprise sector has such a huge impact can have such a huge impact on the diversity and inclusion of of people in the UK. So I wrote the book Inclusive Growth because I noticed a number of organisations kind of taking a few missteps in trying to increase their inclusivity when they're trying to diverse their workforce. And some of the missteps that I saw were that organizations were treating diversity and inclusion a bit like a box ticking exercise, or that it was treated as a marketing activity to increase their profile. But actually, there wasn't enough emphasis placed on the culture of the organization. The other misstep that I noticed was that organizations were not really treating diversity and inclusion as like a change management activity. And what that means is that those organizations were not necessarily understanding the impact of diversity on the workplace. So they weren't they were implementing lots of activity, but they weren't really conscious or aware or able to measure the impact that that was having on the organization. The other kind of misstep that I saw organizations taking was that uh, they were treating it as basically it was seen as the responsibility of only the HR department. Um, I spoke to one of my clients who calls this the kind of the rhetoric gap. in that organizations put in for loads of awards, but what they don't, they kind of put in for loads of awards to try and increase their profile, but they're not really placing enough emphasis on the culture of the business. So what they're not doing is they're not treating. So HR is taking the lead, and they're not really the responsibility of diversity and inclusion is not really shared across the whole of the organization. So, for example, you might want to get your marketing department involved in terms of advertising in diverse and inclusive ways to reach a wider audience. You might want to get your procurement team involved so that you can ensure that you work with a diverse range of suppliers. The thing is, you don't actually need a big budget to increase your diversity and inclusion. So some of the ways that you can get started is, first of all, understand how diversity and inclusion enables your business to grow. And this is why I wrote the book Inclusive Growth as a way of reframing diversity and inclusion. Um, so it was uh, you need to reframe diversity and inclusion so it's seen as an enabler of growth for your organization. Um, and that can help you reach new markets. We know that with greater diversity, it enables you have better decision making, and um, you get greater creativity. So the second thing you can do is listen to your employees, and you can do this through surveys. You can do this through listening groups or focus groups. But what you want to understand is you want to understand their day-to-day experiences. Um, because you want to try and identify in any kind of employee experiences any speed humps or roadblocks that is slowing them down or preventing them from completing a particular journey. So, for example, take your recruitment process. If you insist that everybody has a face-to-face interview, that could be difficult for, say, somebody who's autistic, or if you have a application form that's not accessible, that could be difficult for, say, somebody who's blind to be able to complete it. So think about any speed humps or roadblocks that prevent people from completing a journey. And lastly, find ways of getting your whole business involved. Don't just leave it to your HR department. So, try and encourage all of your employees to get involved by setting up forums or communities. But as I said earlier, try to get all of the key departments involved so that it just doesn't rest on the shoulders of the HR department. So we've got some questions coming through now. So the first question we've got is from Pratiksha on Twitter, a direct message on Twitter. They say, "Hi, Toby. Hey, happy to good to see you. Happy to see you as part of the Ask the Expert. We own a software company. We're a growing team with 30 employees where we always try and look for the right person for the role, but we often see a certain type of person that applies. Are there any ways of attracting talent from all the backgrounds and lifestyles?" That's a really, really good question. I think any organization you do tend to see a certain type of person coming forwards for those roles. It could be down to your employer brand that you're putting out into the marketplace to that that kind of is attractive to certain types of people. Um, One of the best ways of doing it is really looking at the kind of the way that you do outreach or try and increase your amount of outreach that you do. So I'll give you an example. When I was at the BBC in the technology department, we were looking at our data of people going through the recruitment process. And what we found is that when we broke the recruitment process down into different stages, we didn't see a lot of bias happening within the recruitment process itself, but we just didn't see enough women coming forwards for the technology roles at the BBC. So, like software engineers or um, developers and that kind of thing. So, what we um, what we did is we did a lot of outreach. So we ran a series of events called we were called they were called Women in Technology conferences. So they were either half day conferences or they were only a couple of hours long. So we used to alternate them. And that was our way of attracting talent. So we would run it during these conferences, we would run lots of masterclasses. We used to do a kind of, we called it the marketplace, but where we had hiring managers meeting with potential candidates, just explaining the roles, the work that they do in their team. And it was a way of matching up candidates with those managers. And when we identified um, really good people, we would then put them forward to the recruitment process. And then they would have to go through the usual recruitment process and all the interview stages and things like that. So that's one way of doing it, is to really increase your outreach. The other thing that you might just want to be mindful of is the language that you're using in your job applications or your job adverts. So we know that there's very gendered language, which can attract or detract people with masculine or feminine traits. So if you use masculine language, like, you're a go-getter, you're looking for Jira gurus and that kind of thing, we know that that's very masculine language, and that can turn off some people. So there's a really good app called Textio, which is TEXT.io, and you paste your job ad or you paste your job ad and your job description, and it will start to identify that masculine and feminine language. It will also pick up on other things like, are you using too many buzzwords? Is the job ad too long so people don't really get to the bottom to click on the apply now button? It's a really good tool, and I believe that they do a free 30-day trial for you to test it out. So thanks for your question. So got another question from Renata on Twitter. So the question is, morning, Toby. If we have a member of staff within our company that we feel is not behaving inclusively, perhaps unintentionally, how do you feel is the best way to go about talking to that employee to change their ways? Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Um, I think partly it needs to be done in a couple of stages. I think within your organization, you do need to set the expectations about what you consider to be inclusive or non-inclusive behaviors. Again, you can do that in a number of ways. For example, you could create a leadership charter. So a leadership charter could be a list of kind of inclusive behaviors that you expect of people in your organization. So in somewhere that I worked before, we had a leadership charter. Now we considered a leader to be somebody who might be quite new to the firm, who maybe was responsible for leading a couple of people on the team, and they were quite junior in the team, or perhaps they were a senior manager in the organization responsible for 2 or 3,000 people. So both were considered leaders. But we came up with a very simple set of inclusive leadership behaviors. Now, what the good thing about having that written down is that you can then have quite an honest and frank conversation with that individual to say, look, as an organization, we've agreed these inclusive leadership behavior traits. We've noticed that you're not really living up to these inclusive leadership traits. Can we please explore that? It might be that they're just not aware, and that they might actually be quite embarrassed by that, and they change their ways. If they don't, then you might have to kind of take more formal action or get your HR people involved to help you out. But having a leadership charter is really useful, and you can start to bake that into things like, if you do annual reviews with people, for example, you can do 360-degree feedback where you get people within a team. This is really good for managers. You can get team members assessing their manager against those inclusive leadership um, traits or qualities. So got another question here from Liz from Instagram. So Liz says, "Hi Toby, what are your thoughts around the gender pay gap? Do you feel it's going in the right direction?" So I think the gender pay gap has been really important for businesses. For a lot of organisations that I've worked with and some of my clients, that it was the gender pay gap that has really got the ball rolling on diversity and inclusion within the organisation. Up until then, they didn't really necessarily have that kind of accountability baked into the business because they didn't have to report on it. What's really interesting now with the gender pay gap is that we're about 3 or 4 years into it. and that's 3 or 4 data points that tell a story. So effectively, in kind of simplistic storytelling sense, you've got a beginning, a middle, and an end. And organizations are now having to kind of think about the narrative that goes along with these 3 data points that they're having to report on. I do welcome any government conversations and legislation change around introducing other things like the ethnicity pay gap. There's a bit of a mixed bag. I work with some organizations where they're closing the gender pay gap, and obviously that's a good positive sign for them. And unfortunately, I'm aware of businesses where the gender pay gap is widening still. So I think the jury's still out. I look at it on a company by company basis. I think those companies that are closing the gender pay gap, I really do support them, and I really hope that businesses, take more action going forwards to try and close the gender pay gap. Um, so I've got a question from Simon from Facebook Messenger. So Simon says, "Do you think white men will get unfairly overlooked in order to hit quotas? Shouldn't the best person for the job apply rather than having to be a female, black, or disabled?" Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really, really interesting point, and it's a question that I get quite a lot. First of all, the question is about the difference between quotas and targets. So quotas are basically a goal that an organization sets with some penalty. And I don't believe that's a good way of um, really spurring on positive, change and action because, you're right, Simon, that it has to be the best person that gets the job. And we have to be really careful that you don't positively discriminate because that is unlawful. So positive action is slightly different in that what you can do is you can take steps to try and level the playing field. So one thing I didn't mention, for example, in my introduction is that I was born with a rare neuromuscular disability. And so I've been in a wheelchair from since about the age of 2 or 3. And I've had my fair share of discrimination in the workplace. So for example, when I was fresh out of university, I was working with one organisation where the client actually banned me from their office because they said that I was a fire risk. So a lot of that, um, a lot of that has informed the work that I'm doing around diversity and inclusion. The other thing is I'm also a white man. I mean, I tick other boxes in that I'm gay and I've got a physical disability. Um, but you're right. The right person should be getting the job, and I think it can be quite dangerous territory because I wrote an article actually recently for a publication saying that actually diversity includes everybody, and that includes white straight men. Because there is this fear that you could be overtaken through positive action. And when I do introductions to diversity inclusion workshops for my clients, one of the things I say is diversity includes everybody, and actually we should be focusing on inclusion rather than diversity because diversity is a given. Within the UK, we're a very diverse nation. The talent pools that you can draw on are very diverse. So diversity is there; it's a given. However, inclusion is a choice, whether we choose to include or exclude certain individuals. So I think it's important that organizations set targets because without setting kind of objectives or goals, you don't know whether you're making any progress or not. You don't know if you're going north or south. Um, and interestingly, I read an article this morning that said, targets without a date is just a conversation. So make sure you set a date with alongside your goals or your targets. But you're right; it's always the best person that should get the job. Um, so I've got a question here from Chris from Facebook Messenger. So, how can small businesses improve diversity inclusion and open the minds up to employees who may have never had diversity or inclusion training? So, I think with small businesses, it's really important because often with the small businesses, the kind of you've got a you're a close knit team, and you might have a very charismatic leader or chief executive or founder of that organization. And I do really think that it's the responsibility of that chief executive or the founder of that small business to really fly the flag for diversity and inclusion. So one thing that they can do is that the founder or the chief exec of that small business, first of all, needs to understand why it's important to their business. Now, the way that I've positioned this is that it's all about inclusive growth. And the book that I wrote goes into that in a lot more detail. But it's a way of reframing diversity inclusion, that it's not just the right thing to do or a box ticking exercise or a way of increasing your kind of marketing profile or your PR profile. That actually it's really important to the growth of your business. It helps you reach new customers. It helps you increase empathy with those customers who are quite naturally. Um, Most businesses have a diverse customer base, um, and um, so first of all, the chief exec needs to get very clear on why diversity inclusion is important to the growth of the business. And if you're interested in kind of data and statistics, it's worth reading the McKinsey reports. So they've now created 3 reports which are quite famous, which is proving the business case for diversity. And they've just released a brand new report last month, which is worth a reading. And what they've said is, again, they've shown that diverse businesses outperform more homogenous businesses. So in terms of profitability and market share and things like that. So once the chief exec or the founder is clear on why diversity and inclusion is important to the business, they can then inspire and engage the rest of the workforce to try and get them on the same page. Um, you can do training, things like that, but I think actually what really, really goes a long way in any business, whether you're a huge organization employing hundreds of thousands of people, or whether you're a small business employing 10 people, I think what's really important is that the chief executive is very clear on why diversity and inclusion is important for the business. So I got a question here from, sorry, I'm just scrolling down the list. I've got a question here from Balaj from on Twitter. Um, so it says, do you think things get too focused on one area depending on what is culturally hot? Not enough women was a hot topic for a long time. Now Black Lives Matter is hot. I feel like Indian men like me who were born here can't speak up and are left by the side. What's your view on this? Yeah. Yeah, thank you for your question. This is a really, really good point, actually. So I think one of the things that I talk about a lot with my clients is how diversity and inclusion is often kind of siloed or compartmentalized. So organizations say, okay, we're really pro diversity and inclusion, and our focus this year is on women in leadership, let alone women in anywhere across the organization. Um, and then I am seeing, things like because of the George Floyd case over in the States, there's a lot more emphasis around Black Lives Matter movement and things like that. So it's very siloed and it's very compartmentalized. And in I suppose in the trade we refer to intersectionality. Now intersectionality is about understanding all of the different characteristics that we make up. So for example, I'm disabled, male and gay. I can't just tick one box. But unfortunately, organizations do treat diversity and inclusion in a very kind of siloed way. So, okay, we're going to do women this year. We're going to think about ethnicity next year. Then we're going to do LGBT. Then it's mindfulness, and we may eventually get round to disability. Um, and actually, there's a really, really funny film on YouTube with the hashtag. If you just search the hashtag diverse-ish, there's a really funny film that kind of emphasizes this point, which was created by the Valuable 500 campaign, which is a way to try and get businesses to take disability more seriously, for example. And so I work with my clients to really kind of get the conversation moving towards inclusion, recognizing that diversity actually goes beyond just the protected characteristics in the Equality Act, but actually it's like an iceberg. Um, Above the waterline, you can see protected characteristics like somebody's ethnicity, physical disability, gender, that kind of thing. But actually, there's so much hidden underneath the waterline. It could be somebody's LGBT status that you can't necessarily see, but it could be whether somebody's introverted or extroverted. It could be what kind of educational background they had. could be what kind of family background they've got, whether they're born outside the UK, within the UK. So all of these characteristics make up our unique distinctiveness and diversity. So in short, in answer to your question, in short, we need to be shifting the conversation towards more towards inclusion than say on diversity. So I've got a question here from Jen on Instagram. So Jen says, "Hi Toby, as a business, we look for a candidate with the right technical background and experience. Gender, sexuality, or race isn't considered, as we just want the right person for the job, whoever that may be. Do you think that this is fair? How do you think we can better diverse our recruitment process?" Okay, so we're coming up to like the last 4 minutes, and I think this is a really, really good sort of question. Um, you're right, Jen. You know, when you particularly when in technical jobs, I think it's quite. I'll share a story with you working in technical roles at the BBC. It's one thing. You know, you're right that somebody's gender, sexuality, or race shouldn't be considered as part of the role, because um, you know you should be picking people that are technically able to do the job above any sort of protected characteristic. One of the best ways of doing it is kind of setting technical challenges. So when I was at the BBC, I actually piloted some software where we invited anybody and everybody who was interested in working for us in a technical role to take a challenge. Before we even received their CV. So we gave them a technical challenge and they submitted their entry to us anonymously. So the technical challenge might have been, for example, we're creating a new button for iPlayer, and we wanted the candidate just to create the code that sat behind that button with a short test script to go with it. The hiring manager would then review that code and then decide if they were worth calling in for an interview. At that point, we would then release the CV to the hiring manager. What we saw is a significant increase in people from an ethnic minority background getting through to interview, and women getting through to an interview as well. Because we turned the recruitment process on its head, really. We looked at, we got people to demonstrate that they had the skill to do the job before we started to delve into their backgrounds, and it had a significant impact. So I would say, some organizations do technical challenges at the end of the recruitment process. I would sort of say, do it, do it up front at the beginning of the process. Thank you ever so much for tuning in to today's live session. If you've got any questions, please do get in touch with QuickBooks support team on Facebook or myself on either LinkedIn, or you can get in contact with me through my website, which is www.mildon.co.uk. Coming up on Ask the Expert tomorrow is Aaron Patrick. He's head of accounts at Bofix and a UK Intuit QuickBooks certified trainer. Aaron is also a director of Apple Core Group, a small family empire which ensures that he practices what he preaches to all his clients. Tune in tomorrow and ask Aaron for your burning questions. A reminder that if you need any more advice, join the official Intuit QuickBooks SMB community group on Facebook. Accountants and business experts are on hand 24/7. Thank you and take care.